Happy Saturday, everyone. This is day 2 of the Alliouagana Festival of the Word. I am Narissa Golden, your host. And this morning we have for you several presentations that hopefully will help you with your writing. The first up will be Carol Mitchell with Write a Children's Book. And that's going to be a live session, and that we hope you'll put any questions you have in the comments, and she'll try to get to them throughout her session. Following that will be a presentation, a reading by Adiko Simbegele. And we want you to know that's coming on at 11:30 today, not 11. And after that reading, you're going to see some notices about how you can actually join some of Adiko's upcoming free workshops. And in fact, I think one of them might be tomorrow. She usually also has them every Sunday. So you're going to want to get that information so that you can be sure to jump on one of her free short story writing workshops. That's at 11:30. And then coming at 12 will be LaShonda Hoffman, and she'll be doing a session on how to promote your book. Everybody is writing, everyone's now self-publishing, and that means all of the work is on you to make sure that you can get your book in front of the eyes of the people that you want to purchase it. So she's got some great tips for that. She's also making a special offer for you to be able to get on a 30-minute free call with her. So stick around after her session at 12 o'clock so that you can get one of those 3. We've got 3 30-minute sessions to give away. You want to grab one of those. Now I am going to turn it all over to Carol Mitchell, and we're going to get started. So thanks for joining us.
Hey, Narissa, it's so great to be here.
Thank you for being here, Carol. Now, let me just tell them a little bit about you, and it's going to be very, very brief. Carol is a really good friend of mine. I met her when I lived on the island of St. Kitts, where she is from. And since then, we've definitely stayed in touch. And that was what, 2000? I think it was 2000.
We both had
20 years. Yeah. But what's been most amazing is I've been able to watch her journey as a writer and a published author. She is well past me, but I'm so impressed by everything that she's done with creating CaribbeanReads, which is a publishing company, and it focuses on creating books for children and young adults. And she's also now has a couple award-winning projects under that label. So thank you so much for agreeing to be with us today, Carol, and I'm just going to let you take over. Go for it.
Okay, great. Thank you. So it's really great to be here. I love sharing, what I've picked up along the last few years with people. I've had the opportunity in November, seemed to have been my teaching month, where I did a tremendous amount of teaching this, and it's just been such a pleasure and so great to share, and especially with Caribbean audiences. So as Narissa mentioned, I have a publishing company called CaribbeanReads, and we really focus on books for coming out of the Caribbean, mainly children's books, but we also do some adult books. I myself have written a number of children's books. I've actually written 18. I started writing in 2007, in part with Narissa's encouragement, and I have just not stopped since. And I've recently, just the last 3 books of the 18 are with HarperCollins, and 1 came out this week and 2 more are coming out in the future. So, there's a lot going on my side of things, and I have gained a lot of experience. In addition to the experiences I've gained, I've also been able to educate myself about writing. I have a master's in fine arts, and I've been teaching at a university for a few years now. So what I love to do is to just share, tips on what I've picked up. And because my approach to writing is basically that you should write your stories, like the story that comes out, and write it the way that it comes out for you. However, you should be aware of certain rules and certain norms. And if you choose to break them after being aware of them, that's up to you, but it should be very intentional. So what I try to do in my presentations is to introduce you to those norms so that you can then make a great decision about what you'd like to do. So I'm going to share my screen for a bit. I'm not sure, Narissa, is this something that I do, or I'm sorry. Oh, great. Thank you. Okay. So I've kind of gone through the intro of who I am, that I'm a writer, editor, and coach. And so today what I'm going to focus on is we're talking about children's books. So I'm going to give you some general notes on writing a children's book, kind of go through the nuts and bolts of actually doing that writing, and then the revision process, which for me is it's extremely important. It's like the real hard work of writing and something that you have to do yourself before you pass it on to a professional editor. So we'll talk a little bit of some of those things that you can look for in your own work before you move on to the next stage and start looking for a publisher. And I tend to talk a little fast, so you can feel free to slow me down. And I look forward to the questions popping up in the chat. So what do you need to know about writing a children's novel? So basically, the first considerations that I would say is that you need to identify the age group that you're writing for, and that guides the length of book that you're writing and whether or not you need illustrations. So the market kind of divides the market is a little bit divided up in the way that you see on the screen now. You have 0 to 3, 2 to 5, 3 to 7, 5 to 8, 6 to 10, 7 to 12. And you can see there's overlap because, of course, there will always be 2-year-olds who want to read something a little bit more, or parents who want to read something a little bit more advanced than their 2-year-olds. There'll always be 6-year-olds who can read a book that a 9-year-old can read. So we're not like pigeonholing the children. So there are a lot of overlaps. But generally, this is tried and true. This is research in terms of what's the word count that the children can handle before they get too frustrated. What kind of books that they enjoy. And so based on this, I always suggest to people that this is one of the things that you kind of want to stick to. And when I started out, I didn't. I wasn't aware of all of this, and I didn't stick to these rules. And it was okay. The books are great, but I do think that if you really want to target the age group and you want the kids themselves to start to grow as independent readers, then you want to stick to these word counts and the types of books. So if the topic that you've chosen to write about is, you feel that it's most suitable for ages 0 to 3, then you want to do something really simple with just a few words and a lot of images. Maybe like 10 words per page or per spread. That's the 2 pages facing each other. If it's a little bit older, you can grow up in the words. You also want to be careful about the words that you choose, that they're age appropriate, that they challenge but don't frustrate the children. You don't want kids to get frustrated with writing. You want it to be an enjoyable experience. And so it's really important to kind of, as I said, pay attention to these norms and to stick to these tried and true categories. So one of the as you get older, you notice that the word count goes up and also the spread on the word count. So when you get 6 to 10, 7 to 12, you start dropping the fewer illustrations in the book because the children are understanding the story now. You're not relying on the illustrations anymore, but the words are what's more important in them understanding the story. They're becoming more independent readers. And then once you get up to what we call the middle grade book, which is like when they're end of primary school going into high school, then the word count jumps significantly. So, and then there are fewer illustrations. So this is, the first thing you kind of need to do is to know what you're writing about and what age group it's going to really appeal to. And then having made that decision, you kind of know what you're targeting in terms of of word count and whether you need an illustrator or not. For the picture books, you're going to need an illustrator. If you can draw, then kudos to you. That's fantastic. If not, you'll need to. If you're going to self-publish, you need to hire an illustrator. If you're not, then your publisher will handle that part of things. If you do get a traditional publisher. So just some things to think about on that side of things. So this is, I should actually go back for a second. This is just one of the books that we did recently that I pulled out an image from. And you can see it's a picture book and it's just got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 words on that page. But most of the story is, the children can spend a lot of time on this page looking at, what are the father and son doing? What are they cutting up? What else is on the table? There's a whole lot of discussion that comes out, a whole lot of information, and the loving, the love between the father and the son that's obvious there. There's so much that you can talk about on this page that's got 8 words on it that the children can easily read. There's a lot of repetition, and so this is just an example of what you can strive for a younger 0 to, I would say the second 2 to 5 and maybe even a little older than 5 age range for this one. So this is from Belly Full, which is a book we just published by Heidi Fagerberg. So yeah, so the second thing you want to think about is who you're writing for. So that might seem like a silly question, right? You're writing a children's book, of course. I'm writing for children. Well, the truth is, it's actually not quite that straightforward. So the reason for that is that children don't buy books, especially the youngest ones. They don't go into stores and they don't, choose. They may, but it's really the parents making the decision. And I've seen so many parents talk their children out of buying books. So when you're writing the book, you've got to think about what the parents want and also what the teachers want. And what they tend to want is that they want stories with a moral, that teaches the children about being kind or about, passing on your religious morals or beliefs. They want stories where the protagonists are really good examples to children and are, just the perfect child and the perfect, well-behaved and kind and all of those sort of things. The teachers and the parents also want books that support the curriculum that is being taught in the schools so that they can make those linkages. And they want age-appropriate content. They want the children to be reading what the teachers and parents think that they should know about and be exposed to at certain ages. Unfortunately, the children tend to have a little bit of a different interest and different approach. So the children tend to be interested in a lot of irreverence. They want to read about humor. They want to read about, funny things happening. They want to read about, people passing gas. And they don't want to be taught anything when they're reading for fun. They get enough of that in their books. They don't want it to be an obvious lesson. At the end of the day, Johnny found out that it was better to be kind than to be unkind. They'll put the book down. They also want to read about older children. Like children like to read up. So, an 8-year-old likes to read a book about a 9 or 10-year-old because they're thinking about that and they're aspiring to that and they're excited about what they'll be able to do when they get a bit older. And so they do love that and they love reading about older children. And they also want to see themselves at the center of whatever the book is about. So they don't want to read books where the adults are coming in and, in capes and solving the problems or whatever the conflict is in the book. They want to see themselves as having some power, and having some agency in the book. So this is something that authors struggle with a lot. Who am I going to please? And I find that a lot of times people kind of land on the side of pleasing the parents. You know, and writing stories that have these really strong lessons, have these perfect protagonists, and then the parents buy them for sure, but the children don't pick them up and don't gravitate to them and don't, you know, beg to be read this every night. And you know, that's a problem, and especially as the children get older and they start to make some of those decisions themselves about what they want to buy and what they don't want to buy, and they start telling their parents, no mom, I don't want to read that book by so and so, you know, it becomes a problem. So my suggestion would be that you kind of try to land on the side of the of the parents, of the children, I'm sorry, and you know, think about the way that you put across the lesson that you want to get across in the story, that it's kind of rolled up, it's a natural progression, a natural it comes naturally out of the story rather than really being on the nail, that you have protagonists that are um that are flawed, you know, and they're not perfect, and they make mistakes, and then they figure out a way to get around this, to solve the problem that their mistake causes, and they grow in the process of the book. So this is you know, something to think about as you move forward, very intentionally, as you're thinking about and approaching writing your book. So success points for writing a children's book. I recommend that you do some research, and there's different types of research. There's a research that means that you go and you find children's books that are similar to yours, similar to the age range that you're targeting, the topic that you're targeting, and read them, and really read them for fun, and also for structure, and for, you know, what is the author doing here? Why is this book successful? Why do kids love it? So there's that research, and then there's also researching your topic that you're writing about. You know, if you're writing about a story that involves family, or involves like I recently, one of the books I did with HarperCollins is a book on sea turtles. It's a nonfiction, my first nonfiction, it was a very interesting process, and I did a lot of research, as you could imagine, on sea turtles, and also I got together with professionals, with a woman who has a doctorate in that area and works with sea turtles, and just to make sure that I got all the information right, and that I was presenting it in a way that was age appropriate, but not misleading, because that's always a hard thing to straddle. So, you know, you got to know your topic and be an expert in what you're writing about. So one of the ways is research, you know, both on the topic and on just what a children's book entails. Libraries, great place to spend a lot of time and browse. I know y'all have a lovely library in Montserrat, and I've met the librarian, and so I'm sure that there's lots of material there that you can browse and find information, and see what the books look like, see what successful books look like. Another thing is that you want to make sure your characters are memorable. You know, we've all read that book where you put the book down, or seen that movie where the movie ends and you're thinking about, oh boy, I wonder what happens after that. You know, did they get married? Did this child succeed at what they were striving for? What did they become when they were older? And then you have to remind yourself, oh, they're not real. They ended when the story ended. But because the author has done such a great job in creating this character that's very memorable, then you carry that character with them. And so I'm going to talk a little bit later about how you can achieve characters who are memorable and realistic, right? And one of the ways that you do that goes back to the research. You can spend time with children. You should spend time with children if you're writing a children's book. You shouldn't write from a position of some sort of authority. if you haven't been around kids, seen how they interact, seen how they speak, see what's really interesting to them, not the things that the parents and teachers want them to be interested in, but what they really are interested in. So, you know, that's one of the building blocks for having memorable characters in a children's book. You want to have an engaging plot with conflict, and I'm going to talk a little bit more about that as well. How you develop your plot and ensure that it has enough conflict. I mean, nobody wants to read a book, you know, Marlon woke up in the morning, he went to the store, he bought an ice cream, he came back home, he had a great day. You know, that's not really very interesting. You'll be like, why am I reading this? You know, what's so interesting? What should I get out of this? And so it's very important that you have a plot that moves along at a particular pace, that is interesting, and most importantly, that has some conflict, that the some struggle that your characters are facing, something they have to overcome, so that they so that they so that the story is interesting and people keep turning the pages. Because, you know, if I don't like the book, I'll put it down. And so you don't want that to happen, obviously. You want to keep your readers engaged and continuing to read the book. So you also want something, especially for children, that stimulates their imagination. So, you know, makes them think about, wow, I wonder if, what would happen if uh, um, a monkey could communicate? What would happen if a a, a spaceship landed on my backyard? You know, they should be stories. Your story should kind of make your the children think a bit about what if. And you know, that's part of what reading does. It helps you to imagine a new world and to stimulate your imagination in that way, and lead you then in the future to, you know, start to create your own things and become an inventor in the world, and someone who contributes very positively to the world. So that's one of the benefits of reading, and so one of the reasons that we really push children to read. Just one of the many reasons. And you want to make sure your story has realistic dialogue. So this again goes back to the research. So you can see why research is the first thing, right? You spend time around children, you listen to the way they speak, you make sure that your dialogue is not stilted, so that, you know, you want to use contractions in the dialogue, and you want to use language that children will use and relate to. So that's something that you need to spend some time on. And I have a whole presentation on dialogue, so I'm not going to get into that here, because that's a pretty deep, you know, I dig pretty deep into that topic. And then finally, and maybe this should be first near the research, but this is really, really important, that the book needs to be focused on children. So you may be tempted to write a book where at the end the parent comes in and says, okay, Johnny, you should not have done that. This is the right thing that you should have done. Or, you know, the parent is the one who pulls them up from the side of the mountain, you know, throws down a rope and helps them up. Or the parent, you know, whatever it is, the parent is the one who goes to the teacher and says, you know, can you please help this kid? Whatever it is that the parent or the adult intervenes. Children are not interested in that sort of book, to be quite frank. And so you need to ensure that your book is really focused on the children, the child characters in your book, that they're able to. I mean, of course, there's some things that they can't do for sure, but that for the most part, that they're able to have a lot of agency, to have a lot of control in the story, to have a lot of to guide the action, and to be the ones at the end to solve the problem that they created or that was foisted on them. And if you do that, you're like halfway there to having a successful a successful children's book. So, those are kind of some of the things I really want you guys to focus on and to think about and to remember as you're moving through the writing your book. So I'm gonna go on now to like a little bit more detail in some of those points. And there's a lot of information here, and I want you to just keep in mind all the time what I teach, like the rudiments and these things of writing. There are always some people that I suggest to them that you forget everything that I said for now and just write your book and write your story and get it on the page. And then once you've done that, then you go back and you're like, okay, I remember all the things Carol told me. Let me go back and make sure I'm not making those mistakes. It's not the most efficient way to write, but if you find that this is all, that it's a lot and that it's stopping you from moving forward, then that's my recommendation, that you just forget all of this and write, and then come back in the revision process, which I'm also going to touch on a little bit if I have time, and come back in that process and make sure that you're intentional about all the things that I'm saying. And I'm going to repeat that at the end because I think that that's really important. When you write, everyone has their own view and they have their, advice that they're going to give you. But at the end of the day, it is your book and your idea and your story that you're trying to tell. And if it's not down on the page, then there isn't anything. It's not going to end up as a book. So you really have to get started and to get it going. And if you need to just ignore everything to do that, then that's perfectly fine. What's not perfectly fine is if you don't go back and revise and think about these things as you're revising. So let's get going on a little bit more detail. So the first thing is where are you going to start the book, right? How are you going to start writing? I'm sorry. So you want to set up a space. I would recommend that where you write, like this is your writing space. People suggest that for sleeping you have a particular place to sleep, that you tend not to have too many distractions around it. I know a lot of us don't do this, and that helps you get a better sleep. So similarly, you can consider having a spot that you go and write, and this is your writing spot. It doesn't have to be large, and your things are there, and your however you choose to write, whether by on a laptop or on a desktop or on a piece of paper, which is unfortunately my preference, that it's there and that's your space. And then you set up a space, not only a physical space, but a time space as well, when that you allot to writing. And I remember being in a presentation with Narissa recently, and she said that don't give your worst time to your writing. And this is something that I do all the time. I tend to write late at night when I'm, kind of tired already. And so don't do that, right? You want to give yourself, treat your book well. So, and give yourself a spot in the day when when you're fresh and you're able to really give everything to what you're writing. Then you want to consider setting a schedule for writing. So this is in two ways. What I said before in terms of a time, specific time when this is my writing time, and you need to be very intentional about that. So, for example, if you have a doctor's appointment, you tell your employer, or your family, or like, I have an appointment at this time. I'm sorry, I can't do XYZ that you've asked me to. I have this doctor's appointment. So you want to treat, or if you're a regular churchgoer, Sunday morning is the time you go to church. You don't schedule anything else during that time. So you want to treat your writing in a similar way. Treat it like it's important to you, and then the people around you will also eventually learn to respect that. So if you set aside a time and you say that you're not going to take on anything else in that time, then that will be very helpful in terms of you moving forward with your book. I remember I met Aru Kwan, who's a very well-established author, and she said that she writes at a specific time, and there was an incident where a friend was coming from who she hadn't seen in a long time, and she actually chose the only time the friend could meet her was during her writing time, and she, respected her writing time and stuck to it. Now, that might be not the decision everyone would make, but for her, it was important because I guess once you start making exceptions, then where does it end, right? So she really stuck to it despite the fact that it might mean not being able to, it might have meant not being able to meet with someone that she was really important to her. They worked it out, but she preserved that time, and she was respectful for that to that time that she'd set aside for writing. I also suggest that you pace yourself. Like I was working with someone yesterday, and we set a deadline for finishing the first draft, but then we also set some in between deadlines because when you have that big deadline, you can easily end up just doing all of it to the last 2 days when you're like, oh my gosh, it's I promised to finish this tomorrow. But we set milestones in between for what would be and how many words would be complete rather than what chapters or whatever, but how many words would be complete by the intermediate deadlines. And I just got a message from her this morning. She's like, I got up and I wrote this morning for an hour. So, that's really great. She is happy that it's working and she's working towards something, and she has these milestones that she's going to meet. And she's not going to beat herself up if she doesn't meet them, but at least, she has a target. She can see the progress, and that's always very helpful as well. So I am a recommender of planning your books, of outlining. I didn't start off that way. I was in the industry. They call up your pantster, like you're going by the seat of your pants. If you don't plan your books, if you just start writing, and as it comes, as it flows, and a lot of people write like that. A lot of famous people write like that, and there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And I have done it, and I still do it occasionally. However, there's several reasons not to do it, or at least to start with a plan, and then you can kind of move forward. There's several reasons to do it or not to do it. So, and I guess the answers to most things when it comes to writing is it depends. But these are some of the reasons for planning or outlining your book, right? It helps you if you have an outline from the beginning. It helps you to have like a strong visual of where the story is going, of the overall direction, where the characters are going. It helps you to ensure that to see the holes in your plot even before you get started writing, and to address them instead of addressing them after the fact or when someone else points them out to you. It helps you to make sure that your characters develop consistently over the course of the book if you can see it outlined. And it also provides you a base from which you can keep going when you get stuck. And this is one of the main reasons that I outline. When I wrote Fury on Soufriere Hills, which is set in Montserrat, I got to a point in the book where the characters were on the island. There's a volcano. It's set pre-Columbus. And they're with the First Nations people, and I couldn't figure out how they were gonna get off the island and back into the present time. And it sat there for months. I'm telling you, months, and they were just sitting there waiting for me to get them off this off this volcano, and I couldn't figure it out. And the point was that I hadn't really, I had the idea for the book, but I hadn't really planned the whole thing, and so I got stuck. So if you have a plan, then you already know kind of where it's going, and you can continue writing, and you don't end up with these situations that can really stilt and stutter things for a while. So those are kind of the reasons that I think that planning is important. However, as I said, a lot of people don't do it, and it really is up to you. But especially if it's your first book, I would suggest, try it and see if the outlining works. And the outlining is really a tool rather than it's not like an edict. So if you write an outline and then you decide that it's not really the way that you want to go, you can abandon it or change it, or it's not meant to restrict you. It's just meant to kind of guide you along the way. So I highly recommend planning your book, especially like I tend to write a lot of non-mania stories as well, so it's helpful to me to kind of keep track of things and who is where when, and just make sure I don't make any mistakes in terms of the plot, development of the plot. And the last thing I want to talk about in terms of where you start is understanding like what your book is really about. Okay, so I recently watched the movie The Queen's Gambit. It's a miniseries based on a book, and the story it tells the story of a young woman who's basically a brilliant chess player. She ends up, well, I wouldn't spoil the ending for you, but she's a brilliant chess player, and it tells the story of her journey from not knowing anything about chess to playing chess against the masters, the grandmasters of the world. By the time she's in her early 20s, she starts when she's about 9 or 8, and when she's very, very young, she's already at the top of her game and playing the top and much older men. But the story is really about this, the struggles and the difficulties of being a young person and so brilliant. And she struggles a lot with she abuses drugs and alcohol, and she really has a lot of difficulties on that end of things. And so that's the about of the story. It's not about chess. It's not about it's about a lot of things, but it's not about chess. That's just the story. That's like the vehicle. Some of the common, so we tend to call those themes, right? And some of the common themes that we address in children's books are courage, friendship, belonging or identity, family, perseverance, growing up. Then there's loss and grief, anger, suffering, jealousy, and for some of actually for all of the books, because there's different types of love, right? It's not all romantic love. There's love. So you need to understand which combination of these themes your book is really about. And so that as you're going along in your plot, as your characters are developing and unfolding, we can see we can feel that coming through, and we can understand that in an organic way, right? So if you're aware of it and it's in the back of your mind, like what you're really trying to talk about, what you're really trying to address, then it kind of filters through into your writing in an organic way, as I said before, and the children don't feel like they're being bonked on the head with a lesson, but they do get the picture and they get the idea that you're trying to convey. So it's really important. And as you're reading, going back to the research again, and you're looking at children's books, it's another thing you can think about, like, what is this children's book really about? The Chez series is one of the first like picture book that I did was Chez in Paradise, and that story it tells about Chez is a monkey, and he's trying to get at this garden, but he's trying to find a garden that has a lot of fruits that he loves and that he can be in the garden without being, without humans or dogs or anyone else stopping him from getting what he wants. And so but the story really kind of becomes about a little bit about family, because his brothers, and he has some pushback there, and it's about perseverance to a large extent, and a little bit about courage and growing up. So, those are kind of the underlying themes that when the kid is finished with the book, that they're sort of thinking about, how did he overcome? How did he, keep going even though he had obstacles? How has he matured a bit? Chi doesn't really mature, but anyway, how does he mature a bit over the course of the book? So these are things that are kind of there being carried along in the vehicle of the plot of the story. So you kind of should be aware of this. And if you're not, it doesn't mean that it's a bad story. Sometimes it kind of comes to you. You get an idea for the story, and then later on you kind of understand what it is that you're writing. And so there's no one way to do this, right? And don't let anyone tell you there's any one way to do this. There isn't one way to do this, but you can, as you move forward, make sure that you're sort of thinking about, what am I really saying? What am I really trying to convey in this story, in this book? Okay, so in terms of actually getting started with your writing, or the beginning of your writing, there's somebody famously said, start as close to the end as you can. So there was a time, and we'll get to this a little bit later, where we would have a long ramp up, once upon a time. The modern children's books aren't written like that anymore. You see, I have this image. I'm sorry. With you start right where the king swipes, um, swipes his nemesis, and then you move forward from there. The thing about the beginning is, like, don't worry about it too much. Just start writing where you think the beginning should be, and then later on when you come back, you can move it, you can change it, you can say, I think that this is a more effective start. Like, you want to jump into the story, you want to capture. You have like 2 seconds to capture the kid's attention, right? So you want to make sure those first words, they're in it, they're in the story. They want to be reading, and they want to continue reading. But as I said, like, don't worry about it. That's something that you can always come back and change in revision. So you understand, I keep talking about revision and talking about revision because it's such an important part of the whole writing process. So in terms of the characters, I mentioned that they have to be really realistic. And this is just, you can take a screenshot of this if you're watching. Basically, these are some of the things that you want to sit down and to understand about your characters, especially your main character. But I would suggest that you, to some extent, that you also know the secondary character as well. Also, I suggest that you know things about your character that don't show up in the book. If you're writing a simple picture book, the physical quirks, we may never hear about their parents, but if you understand the character well, things that show up on the page and don't show up the page, you will write a better book. And the other thing is that when you're answering these questions, they're not one-word answers. So you want to know the character's name, but what does the name mean to them? How did they get that name? Are they named after a grandparent, a parent? Did their parents love Tchaikovsky, so they named the child after him? What is the origin of that name? How do they feel about the name? Do they like it? Do they hate it? Do people shorten it and they hate that they shorten it? Just there are a lot of things. Their age. Are they young for their age, old for their age? Are they wishing do they have an older sibling and they wish they were older? Or is life stressful as a child and you wish that you could go back a couple years? so those sort of things. How do they feel about their ethnicity, about their body type, about their siblings and parents? Do they have any? Where are they? So there's an author I'm working with who the child has it lives with her mother, and the father doesn't feature in the story at all. But she still needs to understand what happened, because if if the father has passed away, if the parents are divorced, if the father has just never been in the picture, all of those things influence the child. So the author needs to understand that, and that will then come out in the writing. And then you also need to know, down at the bottom here, is what's really driving the the character. So what are their strengths and what are their fears? What are they afraid of that is maybe holding them back from solving the problem that they have in the story, that's creating the problem in the story? A lot of bedtime stories, the children have a fear in the stories, have a fear of the monster under the bed. What does that monster really mean? Is there some daytime issue that's happening that's causing the child to have these fears? Where is it really coming from? And again, even though that may not be in the book, by understanding that, then you write a better story. You write a better story. So those are some of the things that you want to know about your character, and what they really care about. And this helps you then to write a stronger character, to write a character that feels realistic to the reader, to the children when they're reading them. So as I said, you can take a screenshot of this, and there are lists everywhere. Like, you can find lists if you Google on how to, character diaries, sometimes they're called, and what kind of things you can write and how to go about writing them. So some other notes on characters. I mentioned already, children like to read up. So 5-year-olds like to read about 6 and 7-year-olds, and 8-year-olds like to read about 9 and 10-year-olds, and so on and so forth. And at certain ages, it becomes a little bit tricky, because the things that a 15-year-old are realistically interested in may not be really appropriate for a 12-year-old, for example. So you really have to think about what who your audience is, what age you're writing for, and to some extent what appropriate. I would suggest that, outside of writing about sex, I think that I would not worry too much about that, because the truth is that, younger children are hearing about things happening with older children. And if they can get some of that information from a book that is presenting it in a wholesome way, or whatever, an understandable way, a fact-based way, then that may also be a good thing. So I wouldn't worry too much about that. But just keep in mind that if your main characters are 11, your audience might be 9 and 10-year-olds. So in terms of, what happens in the language and all that sort of things, you need to think about that. So your characters need to have agency, and the choices that they make should be what drives the story. And I'm going to mention this again later. If the character comes upon a particular point of view, like I like to use the Three Little Pigs as an example, right? You have the three brothers, they get put out of the house, and they each have to make a choice of what kind of house they're going to build. So if the first pig had built a house out of brick, that would kind of been the end of the story, right? But the fact that the first pig actually builds a house out of straw, then gives the story, it takes the story on a different turn, because then that pig's house is destroyed. So the character's decision, there should be what makes the story move forward and determines where the direction the plots go and who the characters are. So that character, in my version of the Three Little Pigs, that brother is a little lazy. He's a little, he doesn't want to go and spend the extra time, and so he ends up making that decision to build his house out of straw, and that just drives the story into the next into the next level. And so the characters and who they are should be what drives the plot and determines what, when it gets to a crossroad, which way things go. I would suggest that in children's books that you don't have a large swath of characters because the children get confused. You have limited words to get your idea across. You want to focus on, the development of the main characters, and so you're like you have limited real estate and you have to choose. So I would suggest that you don't have a whole lot of named and features characters. You want to avoid stereotypes, of course. You don't want to have the dumb jock, the dumb sportsman, and then the smart, bookish kid. Mix it up, and have them be complicated. And that takes me on to the other thing, which is having complicated heroes and villains. One of my favorite villains is Maleficent. She's definitely a villain, but she's also like, you really can kind of get to love her in a way because she's conflicted and you understand kind of where she's coming from. You could sort of see that maybe you could have been in a similar situation if you had had the experiences she had, but she's definitely a villain, 100%. So, you can have villains who are just not, who are really, can still reach the audience and have them thinking about them and maybe sympathizing with them a little bit. And similarly with heroines, you don't want them to be just completely perfect. You do want them to struggle with moral dilemmas and moral questions and then, overcome that in the end. So that's really important as well. And finally, that, I said to you before that in characters, you need to know everything about your character that you can imagine, but you don't want to put that in the book unless it's relevant. Like, so don't think like, oh my gosh, it's such a great idea about this character that, they love pink. But if it just is not relevant and doesn't come up in the story, then that, you can keep that bit of detail to yourself. And when you're having interviews about your book, you can talk about it then. But if it doesn't relate to the story, then you need to resist the urge to keep it in. So I'm going to, I know I've been talking a lot, and I am actually going to talk a bit about plot. I'm going to move a little bit quickly through this. And what you guys can do is, I have a website, writewithcarol.com. And so if you have questions, you can contact me through there. But I noticed it's 9:50, so I'm going to speed up just a little bit because there's a lot of information that I have that I can present to you. So let's talk about a bit about plot. So the plot of the events that tie together, like what's actually happening in the story, and that tie together to make your story. It should be very closely intertwined with the character development arc, and that's kind of what I was saying before, where the character's decisions and who the character is should be what drives and moves your story forward. And you've got to have high stakes conflict. So, and think about that, right? It's not just that you need to have conflict, but you have to have conflict that matters. If the character is deciding between vanilla and chocolate ice cream, that could be something that's a conflict for them. But unless there is something that will happen if they make the wrong choice, something significant, something that's going to impact their life if they make the wrong choice, then it's not really conflict that's book worthy. So there's got to be something at stake. You have to ask yourself after you finish writing, what was at stake for the character? Like, what was, if they didn't succeed, what would happen? And is it significant? Like, will anybody care? Because if they don't care, what happens if the character doesn't succeed, then they're not going to care about the book very much. So your conflict, there has to be something at stake. So in terms of plot, what you're seeing before you is the Freytag Pyramid. Freytag was a German playwright, I believe, a dramatist, and this is used a lot in drama, but it's also very useful when you're doing your book. So along the bottom here, this is the time that your book is taking place, right? And this is an older version. So, as I said, it's a traditional diagram. You have the exposition, which is the time that you spend setting up what the current situation is now. So the three little pigs, the current situation is that the initial situation is that they're living with their mother. There are a lot of versions of the story, so just go with me, right? So they're living with their mother in a house in the woods, right? And then the inciting incident, the thing that happens that makes this a story, is that the mother decides that she's too poor. These guys are old enough. They should be out on their own. And she's like, I can't feed y'all anymore. You need to go. And so that's the inciting incident. The rising action is they leave, they go out to find their own fortune, and you see how that progresses. One does something, another does something else, and then the real climax of the story is when the wolf is trying to blow down the house that's built with brick, or with something strong. And then the brothers succeed, and then you have the reversal, which is that the brothers succeed, the the um, the the wolf comes through the chimney, he falls into the boiling pot, and the situation is resolved, right? And then the denouement, which is kind of like the wrap up, the three little pigs lived happily ever after. So that's kind of the way. And you can see the climax takes place pretty much on the timeline in the middle of the story. So in more modern books, oops, hold on a second, let me just make sure I didn't. Okay. So in more modern books, the rising action, if I can go back for a second, the exposition, I'm sorry, is much, much shorter, and the denouement is much, much shorter. And then there are many, many complications. So on this screen, which is the very first paragraph in a book called The Shaman's Apprentice, Yaku Shaman, whose giant body time had shaped and worn, forced himself awake into icy silence. A sense of yearning, the last breath of his dreams, was shattered in an instant as he saw the faint glow of morning slipping around the hide door that shielded his entry and falling through the smoke hole in its roof. He was late. Never had this happened, and it could not happen now. The lives of those people depending on him. So important was it that he could almost believe time would stop and wait for him to catch up. So in this story, you see that they jump right in. The status quo, the exposition, is basically in the first line. We learn that this guy, he's large, he's old, time has shaped and worn him, and he's been forced awake into icy silence. And then we're immediately kind of in the action. He's late, and that's a problem. That's a big problem. The lives of his people depend on it. And so you've already had, in that first paragraph of the book, you've got a glimpse into what the situation was, and you already have the inciting event happening right there. So you can see the way that they jumped right in. So the more modern presentation of a plot diagram would look like this. I just need 1 second. I'm really sorry. To just make sure that follow. Okay, so the more practical plot diagram, you have a very short exposition time, like in that one. You have multiple complications, not just one. The climax happens a little bit later, so you see we're no longer climaxing in the middle of it, but near the end. The reversal is very quick, and then you're out of there. Very short denouement. Once the plot is resolved, you got 2 seconds to end the story because the kid is now putting down the book and no longer that interested in reading. Okay, so let's think about the Cinderella. I like to use these stories because a lot of people are familiar with them at some level or the other. So in Cinderella, the exposition is the status quo, like what's happening at the beginning of the story. Cinderella and her dad living together. Her mom has sadly passed away, and I guess he just decides that he needs to have a woman in his life, and so he finds this woman with 2 daughters, and he marries her, and that's your first inciting incident because after that things go really badly. So this section here might be the when we discover that this is not a happy situation for Cinderella, right? The next inciting event might be when they hear about the ball, and this section here might be Cinderella is excited, like she thinks she's gonna go. Another incited incident might be when they say, "No, no, no, you're not going to the ball. Are you kidding? Like, why would we have Cinderella going to the ball?" And so you see the story kind of develop. Another incident is, and some of the inciting incidents could be positive ones when the fairy godmother appears and gets her dressed up. And then the climax of that story is where the prince is at the house, and he's putting the shoes, trying the shoes on each of the stepsisters, and they're cutting off their heels to try and fit their feet into the shoe. And this does not seem suspicious to anyone, but anyway, we're gonna roll with it. And then he discovers Cinderella, and it's ta-da, she's transformed back into the beautiful dress. Because, okay, I'm really sarcastic about this story, so just bear with me, but she's transformed back into the beautiful dress because he could not possibly recognize her if she wasn't all looking beautiful. And that's the climax of the story. And then you have the reversal, where the stepdaughters get their due. The crows, in the original book, crows peck their eyes out. The stepmother is dealt with. That's your falling action. And depending on what version of the story you read, the prince and Cinderella live happily ever after, or Cinderella says, I really like dancing with you, but I don't really want to marry you. But that's like the resolution of the story, and then we're out of there. They live happily ever after, and it's up to the reader to imagine, in the time that they live with your characters off the page after the book is finished, to imagine what may have happened there. So basically, you want to have those multiple inciting incidents, a climax, quick reversal, and then you're out of there. And you might think, well, what is Carol talking about? Because some of these books that you read, they don't really have, like the picture books, the little ones, they don't really have a lot of plot and inciting incidents and things like that. But if you look really careful, for example, last night I was thinking about not the cat in the hat, green eggs and ham, right? And you have 2 characters, and one of them is trying to influence the other one to try something new. And so the story is about, being a little adventurous and trying something new, right? And at first, the other character resists, and he doesn't want to try the green eggs and ham, and he's giving all the reasons why and getting more and more and more flustered. And so you have, like, it's almost like each verse of that is an inciting incident. And then the climax is when he's like, okay, all right, I'll try your green eggs and ham. And then, you have the slide down. I love it. I love green and eggs ham, and I'll eat them in all those places that he decides that he will eat them, on a boat and in a boat. And, then that's the end of the story. So even a story as simple as that has this basic structure. And, it's important, as I said, to have stakes and have the complication, and you kind of, even in that one, you get to know the characters. Like, you can have in your mind the character who would be insisting, and the character, the type of character who would be resisting. And it's so simple, but there is a lot to it, and that's why it's stuck through. I mean, apart from the fact that the words, the verse is fun and all that sort of thing, but it's also about the story that's carrying all of that underneath it. So yeah, think about this when you're writing your children's book, no matter how what the book is. So just a couple other things that you want to think about. The setting of the book, of course, is important, and especially if you're writing a Caribbean-based book, it's not enough to just talk about the coconut trees and things like that. Like, the setting should really infuse the story in the language that people use, in the language that you use, the way people talk, the characters talk, and the way that the language you use in terms of describing things, the similes that you use, the imagery that you create. The setting should really be quite obvious in that. And some of the things that you think about in setting, the location, of course, the time is also important. When is this taking place in terms of chronologically? Like, what year? Are we in the present? Are we in the future? Are we in the past? Sometimes in some of the books that you write, it may not be important to the story, so you may not indicate in the story when it is, but you should still have an idea in your mind, like when you think this is set, right? And also the time of day, you might want to think about. And finally, the elapsed time. So, like, how much time is this taking place for a middle grade book? It might be a year of school. For a younger child's book, it might be a night or a day, or so just the amount of time. You should understand the amount of time that's passed, and make sure that if it's over a day, that it's not daylight forever, that at some point you recognize that nighttime is coming. Those sort of things. I mean, it might sound silly as I'm saying it here, but you would be surprised and how many stories don't take these things into consideration. If it's relevant, you want to think about the climate, rainy season, dry season. It's not just, temperate country climates. Is it hurricane season, mango season, things like that. Geography, like what's the physical landscape like, if it comes into play. Historical events, if you're setting it in a particular time, then like I talked about Fury and Soufriere Hills, where they go back into the past, and based on that, they end up in a time just before one of the eruptions of the volcano in the 14th century. I'm always really bad with dates, so I apologize if that's totally off. But yeah, so they want to think about, if it's set in a particular time, was there something that happened that I need to be aware of, or I need to address? And then, of course, the social, political, and cultural environment of your story based on where you're set. And this is something really interesting that filters through in a number of different ways. So even in the simplest story, you might think about, how would my characters be dressed? Who would they be interacting with because of where it's set? Like, just to give a bit of an extreme example, if you were writing a story set in a country where there are a lot of rules about how women and men can interact, and this comes up because of the work I'm doing with HarperCollins, and the books are, to be distributed worldwide, and they have to think about that a lot, whether they can have, certain characters being alone together in a room without it being problematic for, or triggering for people of some cultures. And so, even in a very simple story, just these ideas are things that you might need to think about, and you can decide that, you know, in our part of the world this is not an issue, so I'm just gonna have the kids be who they are. But it's just, you know, these are some things that you kind of think about and decide, be very deliberate about what the choices that you make. So, point of view. Now, this is a big one, and I'm just going to touch on it. Like again, I have a whole presentation that I do on point of view. But basically, you should be familiar with the idea. So, what do I mean by point of view? It's the person through whom we're telling the story. Like, whose head are we in when we're hearing the stories? Whose thoughts are we hearing, right? So if I have this example, she looked at him through tear-filled eyes. He laughed. Don't bother, come here with those tears. So one thing that she looked at him through tear-filled eyes, we're kind of seeing it from her perspective, right? She's crying and he's laughing at her, right? Another perspective that you might have is from his perspective. He looked at her tear-stained face and felt her laugh rising to the surface, even though there was nothing funny about the situation. Did she think her tears would affect me? So in the first one, we're seeing that she's crying, and you know he's laughing, and this is upsetting to her. In the second one, we're seeing from his point of view how he's responding to her laughing. So those would be two very different stories. You know, depending on whose head you're in, you can get a story of someone who's being derided and, you know, sympathy, or you can get a story of someone who's um, maybe been wronged in another way and is therefore reacting to her. And so it's just really important that you understand whose story you're telling and that you stick with that. So you can change it. You know, these are the options you have: first person, second person, third person close, third person omniscient. The first person, the story is told in the I point of view. I did this, I did that. The second person is you, and the person who's going to be speaking next has her first book all over again, which I believe I have a slide on here if I can get to it. She is written in the second person. It's very difficult to do. She does it brilliantly, and but it's typically used for specific types of stories. So most, especially beginning writers, wouldn't really go down that road. Third person close is when we're in a particular person's head, but you're still using she and he instead of I. And third person omniscient is where you have like an overview, and this person this character that's talking in the story, it knows everybody's story. It can get into Jane's house and then John's house, and then it knows what's happening in the future and what happened in the past. And so that can be confusing for a child. So I recommend that for children's books that you avoid the third person omniscient and the third person close. This reader can really understand and get into the character's head. You can have multiple third person close characters, but I suggest you separate them by chapter. So you might have a chapter from one person's point of view and another chapter from another person's point of view. So I'm going through this really quickly, and as I said, I do a full presentation on point of view because it's something we struggle with a lot.
Yeah, Carol, I'm going to jump in there for a second. Merle was asking if the age of the character determines who the audience is for the book. So if it's a 5-year-old child, does that mean the story are for 5-year-olds, or would it? So you mentioned that kids read up. Would an older kid read a book about a 5-year-old?
Probably not. Okay. To be quite honest, probably not. So that's something you might want to think about. Do I need to make this character older to make the story work? If there are other characters, maybe if there are other characters who are not the primary character who are older, maybe it could fly. But generally, if your main character is a 5-year-old, then you're going to get 5-year-old readers and younger.
Okay, we have a few minutes before the next session starts at 11:30. Right. So I don't want to, but I don't want people to not get the info. So could you spend about 5 minutes running through the next few slides, and then we'll tell people
Sure.
how they can get a copy of the presentation after.
Sure, no problem. So basically, the last thing that I wanted to talk about, I was going to talk a little bit about editing, but I'll talk about revision, right? So I've been saying all along that you write, you write, you write. Get the words on the page, right? Get the words out of your head. We can't read them in your head. Got to get them onto the page, right? Once they're on the page and you've written them, then you've got to go back and revise. And then you start thinking about all the things that I've been saying. You look for the hedging in your work. Did you say she began to go out of the room when she actually just went out of the room? Like, so cut out all of that extra language or that extra, like, do you need stronger verbs, some people say no adverbs. That's ridiculous. You need adverbs. They're great. They're part of speech. Let's respect them. But, look at every adverb and question, do I need this, or is there a single verb that I could put instead? Did I start at the right part of the book? Reconsider your beginning. Read it out loud. Does my dialogue sound stilted, or does it sound realistic? Read everything out loud. You read books, you know how books sound. So when you read it, you'll hear it in your head and you'll know if it sounds right or not. And let somebody else read it. Always have someone else that you trust, that you know will give you, not just say, hey, this is great, but give you good advice. So, and I have a whole thing on revision as well, that I do on revision as well. So, I've given you a lot of information here, a lot to digest. And as I said, if you go to writewithcarol.com, you can sign up you can get in touch with me through there. I also blog on carolmitchellbooks.com. So either of those, you can reach out to me to get more information. And of course, if Narissa will allow a couple questions here, we can do that. We can do that as well.
Right. Sounds good. If you have questions, you can go ahead and drop them in the comments. We have a few more minutes before we need to sign over to get the presentation from Adziko. I have one for you. I noticed that I'm always concerned that nowadays a lot of books always seem to deal with the reality of life, when I love to read books to escape. So how do you kind of balance between creating a book that's true to life in terms of the characters will look and sound and live like me, but they're not necessarily dealing with my everyday drama? Because maybe I'm not reading a book, for drama. Is there a balance that we should, find in children's books?
Yeah, I think for sure that there's a place for everything. Someone mentioned to me yesterday, she's like, "All the books I'm reading now, they're so depressing." But there is definitely a place for fantasy, and that's one of the things that we've been kind of trying to develop at Caribbean Reads a little bit, is to get some more Caribbean fantasy, and they do exist. They are definitely out there, but it's hard to get away, because at the end of the day, even with a fantasy, the underlying issues are those, not necessarily everyday issues, but the issues that we all face as characters. And so it's a little bit difficult, I think, to get a complete escape, but by creating around those issues, your vehicle for discussing or for emphasizing or for addressing those issues can be more fantastical and kind of take you out of the reality of our everyday life. But it's difficult, because at the end of the day, people do enjoy reading. It's about things that kind of are close to their heart, or that they understand, or that they can relate to. So it's a challenge, but I definitely understand what you're saying.
Okay. I noticed when you were giving us the rhythm of the plot of how the story works, that it sounds very much like the same plot timeline that we would use in screenwriting or even for older books. Do you think TV and social media has had a lot to do with the attention span, and now everything has to happen faster. We don't get to dive into the, the old world of an old school James Bond book or some other character that took 800 pages to write a book. Do you miss that, or is it okay that our children's books now are just so get to the point? And is that really hurting them in a way because we're rushing them through versus taking a bit of time to develop the story?
Yeah, I had that conversation with someone yesterday. Actually, it was very interesting. That you have to walk this line between what you want to keep the kids reading and then you want to stretch them a little bit, right? So even though I suggested that you get right in on the exposition, that you don't spend that time. There's a book my dad always talks about, Tom Brown School Days, and the first two chapters describe his walk to school and every single flower he sees along the way,
Wow.
right? But okay, so you jump right in, but then you don't have to sacrifice the depths of the story having done that. What you have to do is you have to get the reader immersed enough in the story that they want to know the details and they want to know the backstory, and so that when you go back and you fill in those details, they're open to it and they're willing to accept them. So it's not necessarily that you have to remove all of that beautiful language and the depths that was there. It's just happening a different way. It's like even they used it was very blatant. I know I mentioned the Queen's Gambit before, but it starts with a scene from the 6th episode. And that's actually why I watched it, because I didn't think it was that fantastic. I probably shouldn't say that, but I wanted to see how she got to that point. So it really hooked you with that, and then it went back and filled in everything. So the point is to kind of, it's just a different way. Like we don't. There's so many things we can read, right? That we're a little quicker to judge and to discard a book because there's so much competition for our attention, and so you have to really from the get-go get their attention, and then when they're invested, you can
Okay.
flesh it out.
Yeah, we didn't get into editing at all, but how do you guide a writer who is in love with their words and think it's beautifully written, but actually it doesn't help move their story along? What do you tell them in terms of, making those big cuts?
That's always a challenge. So basically, what I usually do is I ask a lot of questions, like why. So you've got this long paragraph that tells me about when the character was 5 years old and an experience that they had. So why? What is the purpose of this paragraph? Does it move the plot along? Does it develop tell me important things that I need to know to understand this character? And if it doesn't, if you take it out, will I still understand the plot and the character as well? And then you have to make that hard decision. And I mean, my view on it is always that at the end of the day, it's your story, and I am just even though you might hire me as an editor, I'm just giving you my opinion. And so at the end of the day, you can leave it in. You leave it in. I can't force anybody to make a change, but I do really ask that the people I work with, that they think hard and long about the suggestions that are being made, and always measure things on, is it moving the plot, is it developing the character? And if those answers are no, then it probably doesn't belong in the book.
Good.
But
Great.
We've
And
had these discussions, right?
Yes, and that's how we're going to end this session. Thank you so much, Carol Mitchell, for being with us here at the Alliouagana Festival of the Word. You're seeing her details on the screen about that. You are seeing her details on the screen, writewithcarol.com. She's also on Instagram at writewithcarol. And also you can check out the books that she mentioned and other great children's books at CaribbeanReads.com. Caribbean Reads is one of the sponsors for the Alliouagana Festival this year. Stick with us. We have a reading with Adiko Symbol Gailey right up next. Bye.
Okay, bye. Thanks. It's been great.